Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Klint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today, I'm joined by Michelle Henriksen, a seasoned HR leader with over 25 years of experience navigating the complexities of M&A, restructuring, and global HR strategy. As the founder of HG4 Advisory, Michelle specializes in helping small and mid-sized companies maximize deal value by tackling the people side of transactions. In this episode, we're taking a deep dive into employer of record services, what they are, when to use them, and how they can solve major HR challenges in M&A. Michelle will also walk us through a real-world case study where EOR played a critical role in the success of a deal. Let's jump in. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Clint. It's so fun to be with you today.
Well, thank you for saying yes. I always love having experts like you to have these conversations with.
Yeah, when you were talking when you were mentioning that you wanted to focus on international deals, I was like, what would be a really great topic is this EOR solution, because I have like this case study, as you referred to, that just really fresh in my brain. And it was a great learning experience for me.
That's fantastic and really timely. I think a lot of folks are planning to see an uptick in M&A in 2025, and I think a lot of those will be global deals.
Excellent. Yeah, I think you're right.
So, Michelle, you've worked with some of the biggest names in HR and M&A. What led you to specialize in HR M&A?
Wow. So I started my career in corporate immigration, which slowly morphed into global mobility. And in global mobility, I was, you learn so much about statutory requirements in different countries. And so when I was at Huron Consulting Group, it was at the time when Huron was very inquisitive and starting to expand their international footprint. So we had, different expatriate assignments in different countries. And there was a deal that was in the UK, and I was brought in because I had worked with our benefits in the UK, and I understood some of those employer regulations in the UK, the statutory requirements. And from that point on, I was just brought in to different deals, especially if they had the international component. And I loved the work. It was like you were like an investigator uncovering all the nuances of a company's people, processes, systems, et cetera, and thinking how it was going to integrate into Huron at the time. And I really just wanted to focus on HR M&A from that point on.
Well, that's great. Well, that makes you even better to talk about employer of record, given all of that mobility experience.
Oh, yeah, we'll see. It did help. And to be honest, it did help. Just understanding that each country is so unique and different in terms of their employment law. Like, yes, there's definitely similarities across, Europe or across maybe South America, but every country really is so different that you have to understand those nuances to be successful in operating in that country.
Yeah, absolutely. The number of times that I've talked with business leaders who don't understand that it's different rules even in Canada, and they just assume that everything's the same across borders it's pretty stunning.
Yeah. It's exactly true.
So when you started HG4 Advisory, you did it to help companies maximize their deal value. What are some of the biggest HR challenges that come up in M&A transactions in general, and perhaps some of the big international ones, in addition to really needing to know country by country compliance?
Well, I would say like a lot of the the deals that I've worked on since starting HG4 Advisory are smaller deals. So with medium-sized companies. And a lot of times I hear like from the deal team, like we have to focus on the employee value proposition. We want to make sure that the employees are okay. But yet when you start to dig in a little bit more and talk about benefits and costs, they're like, oh, we can't disrupt the financials of the deal. And so there's a disconnect sometimes in like what they're saying and how they want to implement that integration plan going forward. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges because they are like so focused on the costs. And sometimes you really need to do a little bit more investing in the people to make that transition as smooth as possible.
Yeah, that definitely is a balance, isn't it? Trying to figure out how do we make this cost model work while also meet the strategy behind the deal.
Right, right. And then I've seen also in companies that are larger and more structured, sometimes you probably deal with this all the time, but you have that structure built in, and sometimes it's very difficult to excuse me, to fit in this new company that has a completely different structure. And it's like all about harmonizing and the right level of harmonization that you need to not break the business, but also adhere to your, internal organization.
Makes complete sense. So speaking of harmonization and doing some of these global deals, we started off talking about the employer of record services. Do you mind just telling folks what an employer of record is? And we'll sometimes refer to that as an EOR because it's less of a mouthful, but what is an
Right.
EOR and how do they work?
Yeah, so an EOR is employer of record. It allows companies to hire in countries where they don't have a legal presence. So they don't have a legal entity set up. The employer of record actually acts as the legal employer in any given country. So they're taking on all of the legal compliance risks associated with hiring an individual. They're putting them on their own employment contract. They're dealing with benefits and payroll and all of the statutory requirements that must be adhered to in any particular country. Whereas the actual employer is still responsible for the management of the people in this workforce and, roles and responsibilities, performance management, and that sort of thing. But what it does is really, at the end of the day, eliminate that compliance risk from the employer.
That makes sense. So sometimes when I'm explaining an EOR service to folks, I almost equate it to like a temp agency. It's not a perfect analogy, but like Manpower or Adecco becomes the company providing the payroll to the employee, but the day-to-day direction is coming from somebody else.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So, okay. So when thinking about M&A deals, the EOR service makes it simpler to go internationally. It may not always be the right solution. When does it make sense to use an EOR in a deal versus starting a new legal entity and hiring employees directly?
Yeah, so I think when you're in the context of the deal framework, it depends on, I think, a number of factors. It's like if a buyer is acquiring a company outside of the U.S., you want to look at what type of deal it is. Is it a stock deal? Is it an asset deal? If it's a stock deal, you're going to just assume that legal entity and assume that operation in that country. If it's an asset deal, you're not acquiring that legal entity. So then you have to come up with a solution. It's like, okay, well, how are we going to employ these individuals at close? And so you need to solve for that. And usually in the context of a deal, that's a pretty rapid turnaround that you need to solve for. And so from a legal entity perspective, you may, as a buyer, have a legal entity already set up in that country. And so those employees could be hired into that legal entity. But in the absence of a legal entity from the buyer's organization, You really, at ours, it's like, what am I going to do and how am I going to employ these people? That's when the EOR solution is like a real viable, solution. It allows you to move quickly, get these people employed, and it takes that responsibility. Well, it just allows you to employ the individuals, and if you didn't go with the employer of record solution, the company would then be required to set up a legal entity. And that's usually going to take maybe 3 months at the minimum, depending on the country where, the operations are. So it's just a little bit longer, drawn out process. And then in addition to that, you have to say, does it really make sense to set up a legal entity? Because we're only acquiring 4 people in that country. And so you have to weigh a lot of factors, and also, what is the ultimate goal of operating in that country? Are you looking to expand your operations even further in that company and in that country? Or are you just acquire these 4 or 5 individuals and they're working remotely and you're not really looking to expand your business presence there? So I think all of those are some unique fact pattern that you have to flush out to really make a determination what's the right approach.
That makes complete sense. When I think about global deals and specifically American acquirers, because both of us are in the United States, I think sometimes compliance with international labor law can be a little bit tricky just because it looks so different country to country.
Exactly.
How do EORs help companies navigate these compliance risks, especially in global transactions?
Yeah, so a lot of times EORs, well, what I discovered in the process of this evaluation for one of my clients is that they are either set up locally in the countries where they're operating, or they're contracting with local providers. And so in either scenario, they are well versed in understanding all of the local statutory requirements that they're going to have to comply with. Either from their local partner or from their, knowledge of operating in that country. And so that's also a plus, because as a company acquiring another entity outside of the U.S., you may not have that legal expertise, that understanding of all of the complexities of, the local laws. And furthermore, like in the context of a transaction, you might be faced with multiple countries, and it's hard to get a good, quick grasp on all of those requirements. And so that's where, again, when you don't have that expertise of operating internationally, that's a great alternative.
Fantastic. Well, boots on the ground can always make a difference.
Yes, exactly. Because you're like, okay, well, they know what they're doing. They've been operating in this environment for a long time. They have all the local experts. They have HR people. They have payroll people, legal presence. So it's you're buying that expertise, because ERs are not cheap.
Right.
Which
You have to compare that cost with setting up your own entity and running it ongoingly, and the some of the same benefits of using a PEO in the States, which is a separate conversation, but the bargaining power of having that many employees for supplemental benefits, I think, can be helpful. But you're right, they're definitely not cheap.
Right.
So you mentioned when we first talked, having a case study where the EOR played a pivotal role in the deal.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through what happened and some of the key challenges you were trying to address, choosing whether it was worth investing in an EOR service or doing it on your own?
Yes, sure. I'm really excited to share this information because it was a really great project, very interesting, and I learned so much. Um, so just to set the stage, my client was a domestic company, purely domestic, no international operations, no experience, working internationally. And they were in the process of acquiring a company that had around 130 so employees outside of the US in about 8 different countries.
Oh my. Okay.
And so when we were taking a look at these operations outside of the US in our due diligence phase, we quickly realized that um, they were all contractors outside of the US. And that raised some, operational risks, legal risks, financial risks for the client, for my client. And so we were trying to solve for that. It's like, so we have this issue that we've uncovered in diligence, and what are we going to do about it? And so we went through this whole process of evaluating EOR solutions, setting up local legal entities, did cost analysis in both scenarios, and then also looked at some of those factors that I had mentioned before. It was an asset deal. They were not acquiring the local legal entities of the seller. They didn't have that knowledge of working in the Philippines or in India or in the UAE or in Portugal. And they just needed a solution to kind of become compliant in those different countries. And again, without having that legal expertise in any of those countries, we decided, let's explore the EOR solution. And so I put together this, I spoke to probably 6 different EOR providers, and I just started that evaluation process, understanding the fees involved and the services and the capabilities, the systems that they use, if they were really kind of strong in any particular country, like how many clients did they actually service in the countries where we were going to have these employees. And we just put together this major cost analysis. I spoke to these different providers like every week, trying to just drill down and get the information to make an informed decision. And then we narrowed it down. I presented it to, my client, narrowed it down further. And of course, like with the EOR solution, the costs were going to really increase exponentially, right? Because they had a large number of these people who were contractors. We were trying to normalize them to become employees, to, adhere to the local employment laws. So there were going to be real impacts to the employer, to the buyer, and to the employees too, that we were trying to solve for, because especially as contractors, they weren't accustomed to paying employment taxes.
Right.
Yeah. And so we're like, okay, so we have to solve for that. And how do we solve for that? Are we going to increase people's salaries to try to offset some of that tax burden now that they're going to face? There was a lot of change management and employee communications involved too, because we wanted to make sure that once we did decide on the platform to use, people needed to be trained on it. People needed to understand, like, all right, now your whole process has changed. You no longer submit an invoice. You're going to be submitting time cards and
Right.
to record your time, and understanding how to look at their pay stub, because they did have now different components within their pay stub that, with taxes and with different allowances that were required in those countries. So it was a big, integrate process that we went through. And then in some countries, we also had to figure out, are those employees or the contractors legally allowed to work in the country?
Right.
And so in some countries, for the most part, they were, but there was one country where we needed immigration assistance. And another thing with the EOR solution is that they could sponsor people, for the most part, for work authorization. So that's actually another great offering that the EOR solution provides when you are, kind of moving fast and want to kind of make sure that everybody is legal and can stay in the country.
Right.
But it did cause delay. So what we did in the end, we just put together, a staged approach of converting the contractors to the employees, and did like one country after the other, and laid out all of the challenges that we were going to be facing in each country. And, again, educated the employees, educated the buyer. And then the last thing I'll say is, after, we did the analysis and we figured out the approach that we wanted to take, what we're doing right now is we're in the process of setting up a legal entity in one of the countries where they have, like, the majority of their employees sit, and they do have major growth goals and expansion goals in that country. So now it does make sense for them to kind of get fully established in that country, save the cost of the EOR, and build up that internal infrastructure. Still using, though, the same platform that they're using from an EOR solution. So this EOR solution also provides global payroll.
Okay.
And so they're just going to be easily transitioned over to the global payroll because they're already set up to do the payroll for these individuals. So we're hoping it's going to be more of a seamless process. But, we still have to solve for, benefits and, a payroll person on the ground, HR person, et cetera.
Right. So, boy, there's a lot to unpack there. Let's kind of go backwards a little bit. So the EOR is an interim solution. I've heard about some folks doing that, where you need something now so you can close the deal. You need to
Yeah.
employ those folks. Can you talk a little bit about what that transition process looks like? You already mentioned needing to set up benefits agreements, getting some boots on the ground, but what's that process look like using them on an interim basis?
Yeah. So again, it all is about the cost, right? In the end.
Right.
And we were able to, just because of the volume of people we were wanting to bring onto the EOR solution, when I was doing the evaluation, we chose a company that was very much willing to negotiate in their pricing. But it's still pretty high compared to how much it costs to run a global payroll on a per person per month basis. And so, we, we always kind of knew, like, particularly for the Philippines, where they have a big presence, that, long term, this wasn't going to be a good solution. But we wanted to also maintain everybody on one platform. And this EOR solution actually provides us with that opportunity. So while we're setting up the legal entity for the Philippines, we have other people that are still going to stay in the EOR solution because they might be one or two off people in different locations. And then, my client hired a local HR person, and we're in the process of also looking at benefit solutions as well. So they have a
That's
more,
great.
like they're investing, they made a decision to invest in the Philippines and actually grow that in that market.
Terrific. So we've talked a little bit about cost, and in fact we started there, but we also noted that, for example, when you're not paying your share of payroll taxes as an employer, or not paying into statutory retirement funds, or some of those things, it can seem like a lot of sticker shock because you've been paying folks under the table. Was that part of the conversation? I mean,
Yes.
most companies that are acquiring aren't going to say, "Hey, we're going to continue to run illegally in this country." Right? They're not saying that out loud. We're going to continue to pay people under the table and dodge all these taxes. But it can definitely be sticker shock when you realize that the target has been operating in a non-compliant way, and I've seen costs go up 40, 50%. How did you separate out the cost of being compliant and the cost of the EOR solution, or did they look at that as all one bundle? I'm kind of curious how they approached that piece.
Yeah. So we did, we looked at the cost, like current day, like current state
Yeah,
cost, where employees were getting paid this amount per month depending on the country. And then we looked at what is it going to be under the EOR solution. And we took a look at what the additional employer cost was going to be, having to pay those statutory employment taxes and or pension, anything that the employer was going to be responsible for paying on behalf of the employee. We looked at the employee cost. So what is going to be deducted out of that employee's pay that wasn't being deducted?
right,
And what is it going to cost in addition to as the monthly fee for the EOR solution? And we looked at all of that, and it was sticker shock. It was a
sure,
huge deal because, and especially for the seller who, was very cost driven and really, you know, wanted to keep costs down, which is
sure,
totally understandable, right? You're operating your business. It's looking like a very attractive business, but in the end, like they knew that there were going to be some investment costs that needed to be made. Again, and it all was related to their ultimate goal of really, growing their business outside of the U.S., expanding even more in particularly the Philippines. And so, although there is going to be this high cost maybe within the first year, the first 6 months until we got that legal entity set up, in the end, they were looking also at the opportunities for growth and
right.
what those opportunities were, going to yield. And I think, again, it just made eventually, sense, right? And it's still, though, a challenge with the employees who are still kind of getting used to the new way of doing business, getting used to seeing how their pay is, and really both the buyer and the seller in this instance were fantastic when it came to the employees, and they bent over backwards trying to minimize disruption to the employees, trying to keep them whole. There were new allowances that were introduced. It was all very structured, which, again, when you're growing a business, you need that infrastructure built out. And so in the end, it's going to be really great for the employees, because now employees also, just as a result of the growth, they have more career path. They have a lot of opportunities. And so it's definitely a lot of change management, and
Yeah.
it's challenging. It's really challenging.
Well, and in some countries, they've got to have some comfort in knowing that they're working compliantly. I remember working a deal a number of years ago where we converted contractors who were misclassified. They were
Yeah,
statutory employees,
yeah,
not contractors, but they'd been
right.
treated like
Yeah,
contractors. And about 6 months after we closed the deal, he was getting audited by local tax authorities. And because he hadn't been compliant, we stock deal, we ended up with all those liabilities for that misclassification. That was a
yeah,
big check that we had to pay to the taxing authorities because of that liability carried forward. And unfortunately, that employee also got hit because they were responsible for some. So there has to be some peace of mind in knowing that you're
yeah.
not going to get a huge tax bill.
Exactly. It's just a huge peace of mind, I think, for the employees and obviously for the buyer and the seller in this instance, just to make sure like they are completely 100% operating compliantly in all of the countries where they're doing business and and then they, from an employee perspective, especially for those individuals who, you know, didn't have the correct immigration status in a
Oh, yeah.
country, that also protected them from future risk. We did try to evaluate that whole misclassification issue as well, because, in the US, we know, the ramifications of misclassifying contractors, but what is it in the Philippines or in India? Is it the same? Is it the same risk profile? And in some cases, when we looked, I mean, it was even worse in the U.S. It was like you could go to jail for misclassifying contractors, right? And so one of the other most helpful things that the EOR solution provided was they took a very consultative approach and took a look at our employee census or contractor census, I should say, and they kind of ranked the countries in terms of, okay, this is where even you have like two employees here, but given their roles, this is where you might have more risk based on the role of the individual in that particular country. And so we kind of had, we built that into the plan in terms of when we were converting people and in what country, just to kind of mitigate that risk even further from you know, a misclassification perspective. And
Fantastic. It sounds like a really, really meaty project. You mentioned, Michelle, that you went through, I believe, 6 different EORs. What are some of the things you learned that you could share with folks that are listening about how they should think about selecting an EOR?
yeah, that's a great question. So the fees, for one, that was a huge comparison factor in how willing the companies were how willing they were to negotiate the fee structure. Some didn't move. Some were like, oh, yeah, we'll give you this price for this country, this country, this country. And other countries, it was, very high. So just playing around with that fee structure and seeing how we could, manage that additional cost burden. And then I noticed some of the providers had hidden fees. So they charge for when somebody left the platform, when they entered the platform, VAT taxes, currency exchange taxes, like currency exchange, not taxes, currency exchange rates. Um, and so you just have to be really clear when you're looking at EOR solutions to get that detailed price breakdown. Um, and to make sure that there are not any hidden fees. Then the other, and I still don't know what is the better solution. There's a lot of VORs that have these local providers that I had mentioned earlier. And so they work with partnerships in every country because they're relying on those local providers to have that in-country expertise.
Okay.
Whereas there's some EOR solutions that have built out that own structure. So they have set up their own legal entities in the countries where they're operating, and all of that payroll, operational like benefits is all in-house with them. And so they have a little bit, I think, of more control over their processes, maybe even over their pricing. So that's definitely a factor. We talked to current clients and wanted to understand their expertise, or their expertise or experience of working with the providers. We also were thinking long term. We wanted to understand, like, all right, in addition to being an EOR, do you offer a global payroll solution for when and if we decide to set up a legal entity, so we could still keep people on the same platform and not have multiple platforms running? We wanted to understand, do they also offer US payroll? Because maybe eventually that would be something to consider, to have even the US employees and the international employees all in one system. We looked at the dashboards, like, and the usability of the system from an employer and employee perspective. We looked at their reporting functions. How are the reports being generated? How is the billing being generated? From an employee perspective, we did understand like how the payroll was being processed in the different countries. And in the end, like one of the EOR solutions that we went with, I also felt like during the process, I had mentioned they were very consultative, and they were really eager to go that extra mile and offer services. And they've actually been very great to work with since the close, and since we have all of the employees now on the EOR solution. They are very, very customer service focused, and so that's all part of the deal.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, just knowing you the way that I know you, it doesn't surprise me that it was a very, very comprehensive dive. It sounds like you've definitely gained some understanding and really understand this world.
Before this project, I had no experience whatsoever with an EOR solution. I had worked with PEOs in the U.S., but this was, like I said, it was a big learning experience for me, and very, very interesting to dig into it and really understand those nuances. And and I don't it's like in the U.S., like not every like payroll provider is perfect. I don't think there's not a perfect EOR solution, but it's getting you as close as possible to that ultimate end goal. Like, they're compliant. The fees are, I felt really good about the fees that we landed on, considering the whole picture. And we're in a good place in terms of now being able to easily transition people to the global payroll solution when that time comes.
That's fantastic. So
Yeah.
looking ahead, Michelle, how do you see the role of EORs evolving in the M&A space?
Well, I think that in the past, I don't know, maybe in the past 5-6 years, you see more and more people entering the EOR space, more and more companies trying to develop this solution, which is amazing, because when I was doing global mobility way back when, and we were doing our international expansion with Huron, there was no EOR solution around at that time. I'm dating myself, but there was no, and so we ended up setting up these legal entities in places where we had like one employee or two employees, and just spending a ton of money building up, setting up benefits, et cetera, in these countries. And now you don't have to do that. So I think that it really enables companies that, want to dabble in international markets, the ability to really use the solution like this. And I think that EORs are just getting better and better. They're very, very robust. They're all like really more technology driven companies. So, I think for the most part, there's a lot more competition. So we'll see probably maybe fees coming down a bit, and maybe adding even more services.
Fantastic. Michelle, thank you so much for being so willing to share as you always are with our community.
Yeah.
If listeners want to connect with you or learn more, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Right now, LinkedIn. LinkedIn is really the best place for networking. And I would recommend anybody that wants more information on EORs or more insights to the process that I went through, just connect with me.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure we get the link to your LinkedIn in the show notes. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us for the podcast today. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much, Clint. I love being on your podcast and supporting you in all of your endeavors.
Well, thank you. I like to say a rising tide lifts all ships, and I definitely appreciate you helping be part of that rising tide, Michelle.
Excellent. Well, you have a great day, Clint.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Klint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.